My name is Lindsay Nielsen. I'm the marketing coordinator for EcoEngineers, and it's been a minute since we held an RNG webinar. So I'm happy to welcome you guys to this one, Launch RNG Project Implementation. It's going to focus on registration and compliance requirements for the LCFS, RFS, and other programs surrounding RNG projects. And we thought the launch theme was a little bit apt considering how many billionaires have been flying into space recently. A few housekeeping things before we start. The webinar is recorded. Everybody will be receiving a recording to the event once it's done processing, and everybody is muted per usual, and feel free to send any comments or questions through the questions chat function, and we'll try to answer as many as we can throughout the presentation. We always get a ton of questions for RNG webinars, and if we don't get to all of your questions, we will definitely follow up with you with email after the presentation. There will also be a short survey. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you have any ideas for future webinars. Before we get started, let's just play a short video explaining how EcoEngineers can help you in the low carbon world that is today.
Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. EcoEngineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are EcoEngineers.
All right, well, I'm going to take it over from here. Hey, everybody, my name is Brad Plima. I'm a senior engineer and lead our renewable natural gas line of business. And with me is Dr. Roxby Hartley. He leads our compliance team. And together we're going to talk about, as Lindsay mentioned, what are some of the registration requirements? How do you get registered for RNG projects into the various programs? What are those ongoing compliance, record keeping, reporting obligations for the key programs? How do you, just in practice, how is this, how are these applications, how are these credits generated? We're going to talk about that today. For those of you who aren't familiar with EcoEngineers, we are renewable energy consultants, and we do three things primarily: consulting, compliance management, and auditing. And we do that through these 6 service areas. You can see here we do a lot of training and education, regulatory engagement, a lot of life cycle analysis, carbon intensity modeling. We help support the development of RNG and other renewable energy assets. And then what we're going to talk about quite a bit today is focusing on our compliance management team and our audit team. We do that across all different fuel types, various technologies, various clean energy regulations. Today mostly is going to focus on RNG and the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, the RFS, and the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, since many RNG projects are going that route. But we will touch on voluntary market audits, as well as some of the emerging markets like the British Columbia program and the Canada Clean Fuels program. So I mentioned we're going to keep this pretty casual. I think hopefully Roxby and I will have some good discussions. We'll take questions towards the end as well. So just to kick this off, the Renewable Fuel Standard and RINs, what are some of the registration and compliance obligations? You've gone through the complexities of developing, doing pre-development, developing, financing, construction. Now you're finally getting close to that finish line, and now the real work starts on the credit generation, the compliance, and the monetization of these various energy credits. So we're going to start with the Renewable Fuel Standard here, talk about the RFS and what some of the requirements are. So in order to participate in the Renewable Fuel Standard and generate RINs, you need to have a registered pathway. And whoever that pathway holder is the entity that will generate the credits. This does not necessarily mean it will be the renewable natural gas producer. It could be an offtake party. It could be a regulated party. But that RNG producer usually has the first rights to generating the credits, and they can delegate that responsibility to other entities in the value chain should they choose. And what does that process look like from an RFS registration standpoint? You can see, to keep it simple, really 4 tasks. You need to appoint a responsible corporate officer. This is the person that's going to be responsible for the compliance obligations under this pathway. And then probably the most work here in number 2 is you have to hire somebody like EcoEngineers, third-party engineer, to conduct an engineering review once the facility is substantially complete. And that's a key term there is you can't get these RFS pathways. You can't submit an application to the United States EPA for an RFS pathway until the facility is actually built and substantially complete. After that, then you can do this third-party engineering review, which requires a site visit. That third-party engineer will put together this report, which will include all of the contractual pathways, all of the information about the facility. So it's that showing that complete package that you're able to generate RNG with the equipment on site. You can inject that gas into the pipeline or use that locally as CNG vehicle fuel. And then if you do inject into the pipeline, which most projects do, you'll need to have the contracts between you and the utility. You'll need the contracts between you and the offtake party. And that really will complete the overall process. All of those contracts need to go into this RFS registration package. You will have the opportunity to redact and designate some of that information as confidential business information, but EPA does need unredacted copies of all contractual arrangements as part of this RFS registration process. So we do that site visit, we put that engineering report together, you submit a new company or facility application on the CDX's system, and then EPA will wait for approval. So essentially your company needs to be registered with the EPA, and then each RNG generating facility will have a specific facility ID. So one you may have a company ID and you may have a lot of facility IDs under that one company, but both are required in order to obtain an RFS pathway. You submit that to EPA, they will review it, and typically it's been as short as a week, it's been as long as a couple of months. They will review that and approve that if all of the information meets the regulatory requirements of the RFS. You're also required to keep EPA up to date and notify them of any changes. So if you do any major process improvements, you'll likely have to amend your application. If you add end users, that's a notification that you'll need to make to EPA. And so really that contractual pathway needs to be an up-to-date process of how you're actually operating your RNG facility. And once you do get that approved pathway, you'll have the ability to generate RINs under the program. So a couple things to point out here, the key dates, that substantial completion date, that's when the third-party engineer can come on site. And after that date, then you have the ability to store any RNG that's produced in a physical storage location, but that can be done through virtual contracts. So after the site visit date is when you're really storing those, you have the ability to store those environmental attributes in a qualified storage facility. So if you are planning on storing gas in the interim while you're waiting for your registration, and most people go through that process, you do need to include that storage contract and the physical location of the storage facility that you are using. Again, that does not need to be on-site storage. It can be done virtually, but it does need to be identified in the RFS registration package in order to qualify those RINs or to generate those RINs once you do have an approved pathway. So all in all, this process usually takes several months between coordinating the site visit, getting the document review, putting the package together, submitting to EPA, and then getting that approved pathway application. So we recommend starting this RFS registration process about 3 months before your facility will be substantially complete. That'll give us a head start to move forward with a lot of this data and documentation. So once you do have a pathway, you can imagine there's a lot of dollars that are available under the RFS and through RINs. There's also a lot of compliance obligations. And here's just a list of some of the reporting requirements that you'll have to do as the RFS pathway holder. You can see I won't go through all of these there, but a couple, you have to submit these quarterly reports, an annual production outlook, how much RNG are you expected to produce into the future. You do have to do an annual attest engagement through a third-party CPA, and then there's a new reporting starting in 2021 that you'll have to identify and report all corporate and contractual affiliates. There's also some additional reporting on the D6 RIN, which is mostly starch-based ethanol, not usually applicable to RNG. So a lot of filings to make as part of the ongoing requirements of the RFS. Also, another program that you may be familiar with or have heard about is the Quality Assurance Program, Quality Assurance Plan, QAP, QAP, people call it different things. But really what it is, it's a voluntary audit program for RIN generators. You don't have to participate in that, but in the renewable natural gas industry, a vast majority of RINs that are generated are Q RINs, which is the designation that you generated a RIN under a QAP program. That really may be a requirement of your contractual path to sell those credits to an obligated party. They may require you to supply them with Q RINs, and if you don't, there's likely a discount that you're going to have to take, and that discount is typically not worth the cost of participating in a QAP program. But really what it is, it's an ongoing audit program that does monthly document review. We look at a mass balance. We as QAP providers, and EcoEngineers is one of 3 approved QAP providers under the RFS. We have to submit a quarterly report to EPA with our findings to see, is this facility in compliance with the requirements of the RFS? And it also requires 2 site visits, 2 physical site visits per year. So 2 site visits per year, monthly documentation review, and quarterly reporting that we will do to EPA. If you satisfactorily participate in that, you will generate these Q RINs, and they will be identified in the EMTS system, which is where RINs are generated, and you'll be able to sell those Q RINs to obligated parties or brokers or whoever you trade RINs with.
Rob, I just can ask,
yeah,
can I ask a question? So in this, who doesn't usually get Q RINs? What sort of companies don't get them, or don't want them, or need them?
Yeah, I think the ethanol industry, there's not a lot of participation in QAP, and you do a lot of work in biodiesel. What would you say is it 50-50? What's the percent in the biodiesel industry?
In the biodiesel industry, it's the smaller entities that require it. So in terms of number of entities, it's probably more the majority, but in terms of volume, it's probably much less.
Yeah, I'd say in RNG, and really what would prohibit you from participating is a really small volume. If you're producing, a few hundred MMBTUs a month or 1,000 a month, that may not be worth the cost of participating in a QAP program, may not be worth that the value of the RINs. And so most of those are really small producers, but most of the larger production facilities in RNG are participating, because that's a good segue. The obligated parties, there's a benefit. They get a affirmative defense. If they buy a Q RIN that's found to be invalid, they have to go out and replace that RIN, but they have that affirmative defense that, hey, it went through a QAP, we can't be out of compliance, or we can't be held responsible for this. So there's a benefit to the obligated party by participating in this program. So that's just a really quick overview of the RFS. How do you register a project, and what are some of the compliance obligations? Roxby, anything else you wanted to add on just overall RFS obligations as the compliance team leader there?
I think you covered that very well. The only thing I mentioned is that there was quite a lot of fraud in the biodiesel industry because of the lack of QAP, and I think it was largely because of that fraud that the queuing was developed. But before that, all you had to do was update a third-party engineering report every 3 years. And I think there was no other auditing that was required, so it's kind of easy to skirt the rules.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't remember the exact number. Maybe you do, but it was something like 12% of all the RINs that were generated were found to be fraudulent pre-QAP. Some pretty high number, and that number has gone down significantly with the implementation of the QAP process. Well, let's switch gears here and talk briefly about the LCFS, the registration, compliance, where a lot of development that's happened in the LCFS program and new requirements in 2020 and 2021. So in a similar way, when you have an RFS or an LCFS pathway application that you want to submit, you'll have to register that. You have to create an account. This is for the regulated party in order to generate credits. All of the credits are generated in the LRT, which is the LCFS reporting tool and credit bank and transfer system. So similar to the EMTS system where RINs are generated and transacted, that happens with LCFS credits in the LRT. And then you have to import fuel into California. And anyone that has title to fuel entering California has a reporting obligation under the LCFS. And you have to comply with various record keeping and verification requirements. But let's come at this from the RNG producer. The LCFS program is quite a bit different than the RFS program. One is because the RNG producer oftentimes does not generate the LCFS credits, and we'll talk about why that's the case here shortly. But they're still responsible for getting a pathway under the LCFS program. And what does that look like? You have to do all your registration forms. You need to have that account with Carb in order to submit an application. And then you need to put together your pathway application. And similarly to the RFS, you'll need to show all those contractual pathways that you can actually generate RNG, inject it into the pipeline, get it to California, and use that as vehicle fuel in California. You'll have to show that contractual pathway. Oftentimes, that's done by submitting your RFS registration package with your LCFS application, pathway application. But also the key difference is here, because carbon intensity and GREET modeling is a requirement in the LCFS, you actually have to collect a minimum of 3 months of operational data and build a GREET model, submit that GREET model along with your application package, and you'll submit all of that to California Air Resources Board, or CARB. From there, you do that all online. For a tier 1 process, CARB will do a high-level data review. Do you have all the required documentation? Did you submit everything? Does it look like everything's there? What's happening now, starting in 2020, and has been implemented here for about the last year and a half, is CARB now requires a third-party verification body, and EcoEngineers is an accredited verification body by CARB to review that as an independent third party and submit a validation statement to CARB. So essentially what the verification body does is they will review all of line item number 2. Do you have all the supporting data and documentation? Did you build the model correctly? And do you have all the pieces and components? A site visit is required, and a confirmation of the carbon intensity score is also part of this process. So assuming all of that goes well, the validation, positive validation statement is submitted, the pathway is deemed complete and certified by CARB, and then that can be used for LCFS credits that can be generated. So we'll touch on this process a little bit more shortly here, but just before I hand it off to Roxby to talk a little bit more detail on the LCFS compliance obligations, I did want to point out that RNG is a little bit unique in how these applications get put together. A good way to think of this is there's 2 components. You have to show dispensing in California, and you have to show RNG production, those get matched up, and you can generate LCFS credits. But that dispenser has the reporting obligation under the program. So they register under LRT and they report how much CNG or RNG they dispense as vehicle fuel. And they can do that with fossil natural gas, or they can do that with RNG, preferably RNG because there's more credits that could be available. But those two can submit applications to CARB separately and then join those up together through this application process. And I'd say a lot of RNG projects are going down this route, mostly because it allows each entity to keep control of that confidential data. So the dispenser can keep all their contracts, their downstream contracts separate. The RNG producer can keep all their information separate. And both of them are then required, have different compliance obligations, and they're required to conform with the program. And that's what we're going to talk about next year after we talk about just the difference in tier 1 and tier 2 pathway applications. So
you can generate credits in a number of ways. The simplest way is simply to use a lookup table value. Say if you're a diesel importer, you have a diesel lookup value, and you can list your imports in your report, in the required reporting, against lookup table values. And you can see there's grid energy, there's 100% zero CI charging as well. Tier 1 pathways use something called a tier 1 calculator. All these, the pathways both use the GREET model, but the tier 1 pathways, CARB has made simple calculators, and they're listed there. There's a biodiesel, renewable diesel, LNG, CNG, North American natural gas, there's starch, fiber, and sugarcane ethanol. For biomethane, there's North American landfills, anaerobic digestion of wastewater, organic waste, and dairy and swine manure. And the validation process is slightly different between tier 1 and tier 2 pathways. Tier 2 pathways are tier 1 fuels using innovative methods, meet sustainability requirements, 5% lower if reference CI above 20, and 1 CI lower if reference CI is below 20. So basically, CARB is looking for a decent percentage drop in the CI score. There's wet mill ethanol comes to this, plastics to fuel, pyrolysis oil, some next generation fuels. And basically, if you're looking for feedstocks that don't neatly fit into tier 1 calculators, they come under the tier 2 pathways. And I think, Brad, do you have any idea of what the difference is in the timing and how long these take to get through CARB for the tier 1 and the tier 2s?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is delays, the longer timeline in those tier 2 pathway applications, because I mentioned in the process in a couple slides before that CARB does a high-level review and completeness review for a tier 1. For a tier 2, they do a much more detailed review. Those are more complex processes. That process is currently taking several months just for CARB to review that, and then they turn that loose to a verification body. So you have to spend another few months going through that process. So what we're seeing out there, it's taking all of 3 quarters, to get these projects done. By the time you collect all the operational data and then go through the review process and the verification process, and then also on the back end, I know you're going to probably touch on that, Roxby, is there's a public comment period. You have to go through a 10-day public comment period, respond to any comments, and then CARB has to certify the process. So it's definitely going to take another quarter, I would say, in order to go through that process. And we're seeing many RNG dairy. Roxby mentioned that dairy and swine manure can fall in under the tier 1 process, but I think our team was looking at the approved pathways, and I think there's one tier 1 dairy or swine pathway. All of the other ones are tier 2. And some of the things that kick you into that tier 2 category for RNG are if you're trucking RNG, virtual pipeline on the back end, that's going to be a tier 2. If you're using anything other than grid energy for process energy, that's going to be a tier 2. And then there's one where most of these get caught up is unaccounted for or fugitive of methane emissions, you're allowed a 2% threshold for the tier 1 process. So basically, if you do a methane mass balance across the system and you can't account for more than 2% of the methane, which happens frequently with all the metering points and the meter accuracy, and you're above 2, you're going to get kicked into the tier 2 process. So I would plan on the tier 2 process if you're a dairy and swine, and then if you can fit into that tier 1 process, that will shave a little bit of time off of this.
Right, that's rather like renewable diesel, because there's only one tier 1 pathway for renewable diesel. Everything else has been kicked into tier 2 as well. So yeah, that's really interesting. There's a slight difference in the validation process, because for tier 2, your pathway is deemed complete after the carb review. Tier 1, it's after validation. So that can be an advantage. Okay, let's talk about reporting responsibilities here. Credit generators are responsible for completing the following reports: quarterly credit generation reports and an annual credit generation report. That is basically what fuel has been imported and dispensed in California. And that responsibility can be assigned to a third party, but they still have to file those reports. And those reporting parties have to include procedures for determining volumes that are generated. So they have to understand where the dispensers are and how they're registered. You've got the equipment tracking. You've got who's responsible for the reporting and the record keeping that you have to make sure everything's being tracked, and how those records end up in the report. So we'll go through this. There are a few types of LCFS reporting. There's the LRT reporting. This is into the LCFS reporting tool. They're the quarterly annual reports, and basically they say this much fuel was brought into California and sold here. The LCFS verification, this can be done quarterly or annually, but the annual verification is the one that is audited, and it has to be done by August the 31st of each year. And then if you're the credit generator, if you're the person who holds a fuel pathway report, the facility, they have to file a report, and that has to be for 2 years of data, and that again has to be audited.
Maybe just to relate this a little bit to RNG, Roxby, is the LRT reporting is oftentimes done by the dispenser or the marketer, and not the RNG producer. Not all the time, but in general, they're responsible for all the LRT reporting, because that's how much CNG is being dispensed in California. And then the RNG producer is responsible for that fuel pathway report that you mentioned. And really what that is, it's an updated GREET model that you're submitting each year. So you have a certified CI and a pathway. You have to update that year over year with real-time data. And so you're going to have this ongoing varying CI score on an annual basis based on that previous 24 months of historical production. So before this implementation of these new verification procedures, you got the CI, you got your pathway, and as long as nothing changed, you kind of kept that CI score on an ongoing basis. Now you're going to have almost a real-time, year-over-year report, or a rolling 24-month CI score average for these pathways.
And this is a summary of when the reports are due. And I think we have a handout, which the LCFS reporting table is this. And that's in the chat, in the text. The types of reports are the quarterly reports that are filed by the last day of the quarter following the reporting period. And that is the LCFS reporting party who's responsible for those. And that's basically what the credits get generated on. And then there's an annual report that's submitted by April 30th. And that's also submitted by the LCFS reporting party. But the annual report actually isn't the thing that's audited. It's the quarterly fuel transaction reports that are audited. And then, as Brad said, if you are the facility that's making the RNG, you have to file a fuel pathway report, which is essentially the GREET model that's being filled in again with the 2 years of data. And that has to be filed again by March the 31st. And the annual verification report is the auditor's response to the fuel pathway reports or the annual or the quarterly transaction reports, and that has to be filed by August 31st, and that's responsibility of the LCFS verification body. So basically, between March 31st, when your reports are filed, and by August 31st, you have to have a site visit. The auditors have to come in and base their verification on the compliance monitoring plan. There's a site visit, there's a sampling plan developed, and they have to put a report into CARB before August 31st. You have anything to add to that, Brad?
No, I think this next slide here kind of pulls that whole process together of what does that look like. So if you're an RNG producer, you have a dispensing partner, you both put together an application, a joint application, but most of the producer is focused on the CI score. You get that pathway validated by a third-party verifier, and then CARB certifies your CI score. So now you have a pathway and a CI score that dispenser can use to generate credits. That's done through the quarterly fuel transaction reports. The credits are issued, and then you do that annual reporting. And then there's an annual, the reporting of the annual CI data, that's the fuel pathway report. And then both of those are annually verified by a third-party verification body. So this is the overall structure, and this repeats year after year, the annual verification, but the LCFS pathway validation is a one-time process. So I think that's just kind of what I summarized here on the next slide. That initial validation one time, it does require a site visit, and then that's what helps get your pathway certified. And then you have these ongoing verification services of the fuel pathway report, which is the RNG producer's responsibility, and of the quarterly fuel transaction report, which is the regulated party's responsibility. And then there's a verification report that's done by the third party, and there is an annual site visit that's required for verification. So our team is going through that process right now and submitting the first set of annual verification reports to CARB no later than August 31st. So this is the first year. A lot of people are trying to figure this out. I think in RNG, one of the bigger questions is what happens if your annual CI, your fuel pathway report, and your certified CI score are different. There is going to be a reconciliation process, so you may have to pay credits back if your CI score was not as good as your certified score. So we're still going through that process to understand exactly what that will be done, but there will be an annual true up of that CI, and then that will be your new CI score going for the year forward. So that's kind of that rolling year over year process that I talked about. So just a little bit more on that pathway validation process. I'm just going to breeze over these since we talked about these before, but you need to get that validation and that done when you submit that pathway application. So that's a good time to start working with a third-party verification body, even a little bit before you submit that pathway application, to get them involved. So when CARB after they do their completeness review and releases that to the verifier, that process is streamlined and you're not missing out on any time by now having to go hire that verifier. So same thing, Tier 2 also requires a third-party validation. There's 3 potential results for the initial pathway validation and the annual verification: positive, qualified positive, and adverse. You want to be obviously in the first one, but even in the first 2, basically there's no material misstatements that were found. Really want to avoid the adverse, where there are major issues and material misstatements. That will get turned over to CARB. And I think it's important to note here, CARB is ultimately the referee in this process. The verifier will do their review and their report and try to work out as many things with the producer or the pathway holder as possible. If there are things that can't be agreed upon, that's when it's turned over to CARB to be that ultimate decision maker of how to handle those discrepancies. So I know that's really the getting the pathway going, what your annual verification requirements. There's something new also, in RNG and all fuel types called the compliance monitoring plan. I think this is one thing that is sliding through the cracks a little bit on RNG producers that we've been seeing. And Roxby, do you want to talk a little bit? I don't know, how many of these things have you reviewed so far?
Too many. Too many. So compliance monitoring plans, or CMPs, and basically if you're reporting, either if you're a fuel pathway holder or if you're just reporting the LRT to generate credits, you're going to have one of these, because if you're subject to audit, the plan is what the auditors use to figure out what they're going to look at in your facility or in your process. So it has to have basically general overview of your facility and boundaries, all the methods that you use to get the data from whatever reporting you have into the reports for Carb. So if there are Excel sheets or all those sorts of things have to be kept for the required amount of time, and you have to write them down in the compliance monitoring plan. So basically have a flow chart for how the data from your facility or from your office ends up in the reporting for Carb. So that, I mean, what I find is really easy to have basically a flow chart for what happens to the data, and a block diagram for your facility if you're a pathway holder. So the block diagram basically shows where the meters are that are measuring all the inputs and outputs, and labeling those meters. Identification of measurement devices is really important in the plan. There's an awful lot of the plans that are dedicated to the metering, the accuracy, who maintains them, when they were calibrated. It even goes so far as to say if you're going to delay a calibration, you have to get permission from Carb prior to the delay. You might have a good reason to delay calibration because you have to take the meter offline and it stops production or some other circumstance, but Carb wants to know in good time that that's going to happen. And when you're applying for your GREET 3.0 pathway, you really should at least have an overview of that in place. And what you will find is as you develop a GREET model, that compliance monitoring plan is likely to change, because the model is going to come back with questions, say, hey, have you considered this? So all that information, all those changes need to be recorded in the compliance monitoring plan. And it's required for the validation and annual verification. The auditors are going to take this plan and build their audit based on it. As I said before, you have to have all the methods of data collection, all the calculation methods and equations you're using, all the control procedures you have, and the staff who are responsible, because when you have a site visit, your staff are going to be interviewed and say, hey, how do you do this? So the staff have to understand all the different procedures you have for getting the data into the reports. And the goal is to have really good, accurate reporting. It's important to Carb that the program has integrity and the reporting is accurate. So everybody has to have one, as we said, and there's really three parts to the monitoring plan. There's the general part, there's a part for fuel pathway holders, which is much more extensive, and then there's a part for the LRT credit generation, which tends to be credit transfer documents, meter information, where did the gas go. But if you are a pathway holder, you might have multiple fuel pathway codes, and you also have to have the allocation methodology by which you allocate between different pathways. Do you want to add anything to that, Brad? Is that comprehensive?
I think that's good, Roxby. I think you've reviewed a lot of RNG compliance monitoring plans. Do you have anything like, off the top of your head of where do they lack if people are putting together the first time? I know you've mentioned several times of that general first page is really important. Like you've right. Told me several times, like you should be able to know exactly what you do, how you do it, the fuel you make in that first page. Is that right?
Right, that's right. I've read some plans, and you get through like 3 pages and you don't actually know what the facility does. There's no real. So make sure, and when you and one of the jobs of the auditor is to assess risk. And so if you don't present this data well, then anybody's going to think, oh well, this is shoddy. You have to make this a good document, nicely polished. It doesn't have to be exactly right, because when you go to validation, any hiccups, there might be changes to your model during validation. The validator might say, hey, what about this? And then that has to be recorded in the compliance monitoring plan. And it is a living document. Keep it up to date. If processes change, you have to update your compliance monitoring plan. And on the renewable diesel biodiesel side, I typically recommend that if you've got a management of change process, it's worth putting this into it as well. Consider this if you're going to change a meter out.
Yeah, I think another thing we've seen in RNG is have this ready when you submit your pathway application, because once the verification body gets turned loose to do the pathway validation, the first thing they're going to ask is for the compliance monitoring plan in addition to the pathway application. So you don't want to be caught flat-footed there and say, well, I don't even have one. It's going to take you a little bit to put this together. It looks a little bit onerous when you look at the requirements, but that's something that we do here at EcoEngineers every day. And so let us know. We can certainly help with more detailed information, questions about the monitoring plan. I know we just have a few minutes to touch on it here, but we could probably have a whole nother webinar just on compliance monitoring plans and their importance. But I think for RNG, just get started on them early. Talk to people that have done them before. Once you've done one, you'll kind of get the hang of it, and the next couple for other sites will be a little bit more streamlined there.
Yeah, and particularly if you're a fuel producer, you have to work with the person who's doing the modeling and make sure all the modeling picadillos and caveats are recorded. Makes it a lot easier for the auditor, and they'll be a lot happier with their job.
Yeah, I know in RNG too, there's a lot of data monitoring, especially in dairy manure, swine manure pathways. You've got to do monitoring of inlet gas and outlet gas and thermal oxidizer gas. And if you're trucking it, there's even more meters that you're going to do. Think about the monitoring plan as you built your GREET model on your 3 months of operating data. How did you collect that data? Where did you collect that data? What meters did you use for that data? How frequently are you going to calibrate those meters or check those meters? It's really just a best practices of how are you going to manage and monitor and collect and report that data on a regular basis. A little bit more detailed than that, but in general, that's the sense of it is really data focused in addition to your overall general information about your pathway.
Monitoring plan requirements, I think we covered this. First of all, a general overview of facility. Make sure this is good. Actually, often your third-party engineering report for your facility will contain a lot of that general information, which will be really useful to the auditor. And if you're in the QAP part of that, say, yes, we do the QAP, which will give the auditor more confidence that your data is good. Record the key operational parameters. For the CI calculation, say what methodologies are in place. You've got all this meter data. How do you end up with understanding the quality and quantity of gas that you're producing? Where is that data collection, and where do you store that data? Say, hey, this person records it in this spreadsheet. Write those things down in the compliance monitoring plan. There's quarterly reporting specific to transactions. So if you're importing to California, I don't think it's gallons for each FBC. I think that might be, it's not gallons, is it, Brad? I was looking down this slide.
Yeah, I think
maybe FBQs, I think.
Sorry, yeah, I think that's more for liquid fuels, but same concept. You'll have to report the gallons that you dispense as CNG for RNG or LNG, gallons and LNG too.
Right.
Just to kind of round things out on other RNG markets, I know we focus a lot on RFS and LCFS, but we are starting to see a verification program coming into play in Oregon in the Oregon Clean Fuels program. I believe, Roxby, that's going to start next year. Is that right?
Right. The validation, we just had the auditor training a couple of months ago, and if you actually get your pathway submitted to Oregon this year, you won't be subject to validation. The validation is going to be done in-house by the DEQ. If you submit it next year, you will be validated and have to go through audits. So if you've already been audited in California, I'd recommend getting a pathway to Oregon this year.
Yep, starting next year, you'll have to go through that same validation and then annual verification process for Oregon. I think the nice thing with the Oregon Clean Fuels program is they'll accept the LCFS pathway registrations. You will have to, have the ability to dispense this fuel into Oregon as well. So you would get if you're foregoing California LCFS credits, you can transfer a lot of that information over to the Oregon program, assuming you can dispense fuel and vehicle fuel in Oregon as well. So that's a nice feature of the Oregon Clean Fuels program. A couple more things. Canada, the British Columbia LCFS program, that's ongoing and moving forward. We do see some US-based RNG going to the British Columbia program. Canada just passed a Clean Fuel Standard. That looks to be implemented. The rulemaking's going on now, be implemented in December of 2022. We don't know exactly if there are audit and verification requirements of that. I think we're still going through that implementation. Same goes with any new emerging markets, Washington, New Mexico, other areas that are looking at similar LCFS type programs. I think if we follow the history of the RFS, the LCFS, and of the Oregon Clean Fuels program, that there will be a verification, there will be an audit requirement at some point in the future with those programs as well. So just like anything, when there's these kinds of dollars that are available, it's important to, the integrity of the programs are solid, and these audit requirements are new. They are some of them are stringent. You're going to have to do a lot of data review, but it really protects the program. It protects the producers that are generating credits under the program. And when everything works well and everyone's in compliance, these programs are just in a much better light. Maybe lastly here before Q&A, we've seen some voluntary markets looking at custom audits as well, and there may be no audit requirements. It's really deal specific, but we're seeing more interest in an annual verification by a third party in that transaction. Again, not a regulated requirement or a mandated requirement. And what that looks like is very, very dependent on who is buying the RNG. But more and more people looking at putting in place, an RNG protocol to make sure that the RNG that they're buying is valid there. So with that, maybe Lindsay, I don't know if we have any questions there. Roxby, anything else you wanted to add?
On the other programs, I think from the point of it being passed by the legislature, it takes about 5 years before the credits really start ramping up to be worth something.
Yeah, no, that's a good point in those emerging markets. It takes a little bit of time to get built up in the industry.
We do have a couple of questions here. Do you want me to start with the RFS and go to LCFS, or just bounce all the way around?
Yeah, you just lob them out there and we'll see what
all right.
We'll do our best.
So here we go. Does a pipeline tap in a state outside of California have to be an interstate pipeline to take advantage of CARB's LCFS, or can it be an interstate pipeline that ties into another interstate pipeline?
Yeah, good question. It can be the latter. As long as you have a physical pathway to California, it does not necessarily need to be a interstate pipeline. Many of the existing pathways in RNG are local distribution companies or distribution pipelines and not interstate pipelines. Interestingly enough, even projects in Mexico, Canada that are connected to the grid may be able to participate in these programs because they have that physical pathway into the various programs.
So maybe this one's for you too, Brad. What is a typical CI score or score range for a food waste digester producing direct injection pipeline grade gas?
Oh man, we're going to CI. I'm putting a CI hats
CI real
on.
quick.
Hey,
We're
Lindsay,
gonna hold you to it.
I can plug our CI workshops that we did about 18 months ago, maybe. If you
That's
want
a
a
good point.
refresher and primer on those, you can go to our website, and we have some specific sessions targeted towards organic food waste and CI. That's a difficult question because the answer really matters is the material landfill diverted? Can you classify it as landfill diverted material? And if so, you can get some landfill diversion credits, and that RNG may have a negative CI score. We've seen anywhere from -20 to maybe -75 in that range. If 100% of your material is diverted from landfills and you can demonstrate that to CARB. If it's not, if that material was going to animal feed or composting, it's probably going to have a positive CI score. It really depends, but maybe in the 10 to 30 CI score range. And so those are just some general rules of thumb, but always the caveat that you got to model there's so many different inputs to the model that you do have to model each site specifically to narrow into that. But those are some generalized ranges.
I saw the question there that do we do validations and verifications? And the answer is yes, our audit team does. And last time we checked, we're doing almost half of all the verifications for California. That might have changed, but the audit team has been too busy getting work in that. So I don't want them to have to go back and look at the numbers again. But yes, we do an awful lot of that work.
That's a good point. There are some conflicts of interest that we have to abide by as a verification body. We didn't get into those today, just in interest of time, but we're allowed to provide consulting services and auditing services at EcoEngineers, which we do both of. We've submitted almost 300 LCFS pathway applications, well over 200 in the life of the program, and we're doing a lot of the validation and annual verification engagements. The key to that is in this phase-in period through 2023, we can do both, but we have to have completely separated staffing. We have to be approved by CARB in any kind of mitigation plan or to be a verifier. So we have to be fully transparent on what we've done on the consulting side and what we're proposing to do on the audit side, and that has to be approved by CARB. But after 2023, we'll have to pick, are we going to do consulting work or audit work at a company level? So we'll still be able to offer both services here, but we won't be able to do both consulting and audit services, even with the deep separation between the two groups we have here at the company. We're going to have to pick one or the other on a project by project or company by company basis, because we won't be allowed to do both. So we'll deal with that when it gets to 2023. I think our audit team's just trying to get through 2021 here, and August 31st of getting all these verification engagements done. I will say too, I think we're going to have a lot better feel for how this process goes. This is the first year that everyone's going through the annual verification, and so I think everyone's on a little bit of a learning curve here. I do just want to reiterate on the CI scores, that differential of CI between your certified CI score with your pathway and your annual fuel pathway. If there's a difference there in credits, you're likely going to have to pay those credits back. So we've worked with some entities to help. What does that look like, and how should you best accomplish that? We've got some ideas, and we've talked to some people around that. So if that's a concern, feel free to shoot me or Roxby an email or a phone call, and we can certainly talk that through with you more.
So we have some questions here about validation for joint applications. How is that different than not joint?
The pathway validation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the fuel pathway or the RNG producer and the CI, that all has to be validated. That joint application will be validated kind of together. So once you get the CI score, then you'll tie that into the dispensing side of things. So I don't believe, Roxby, there's no validation requirement on the dispenser side, they're just required to register and report fuel in the LRT. I think that's how that works. Is that your understanding too?
Yeah, right. There is an advantage on the verification side as well. Say you have multiple parties who you're working with, then certainly there's an opportunity to have multiple audits rather than one audit, depending on what the risks are. Say you're selling to multiple dispensers, then each dispenser has to be audited, and they might require audits of the pathway or the reporting for the pathway. So you have to. It's better to have a joint application in those situations where there are multiple parties involved.
Yeah, and then also all of the quarterly fuel transaction reporting done by that dispenser is required to be annually verified by a third party as well. So the credit generation side and the dispensing and the RNG production side are both subject to that annual verification. Starting this is the first year, going back to the 2020 production numbers.
Are there any calendar risks as SB 1383 qualifies my CI score, expiration of current GREET model, grandfather of plant design concurrent with certification? Does that make sense to you? That didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think I get the general sense is, yeah, we could have a whole webinar. We probably will coming up about SB 1383. So maybe we'll park a little bit of that for the future here. But you know, I think Carb recently put out an analysis of how close are they to meeting dairy emissions reductions as part of SB 1383. And the report was they're not that close. They're maybe can get halfway there. And so they need more and more dairy emissions reductions project. How that's going to relate to CI scores and pathways, I think we'll have to wait and see how Carb's going to treat that. But I think there is a grandfathering, you know, there is that grandfathering period into the program. So if you do get a pathway and the baseline changes in the GREET model, it's not like you're going to have to change with it. You'll get that grandfathered pathway for at least that reporting, that 10-year period.
One more question on timing, and then we'll won't take up any more of your time here. It says, what's the estimated total time for a dairy swine review and approval for the LCFS RNG Tier 2 pathway?
I'm really glad somebody asked that, because I don't think we touched on the timeline for the LCFS. And so you have to collect your 3 months of operational data, and then usually that you have, once you submit the application, you have a 6-month window to get that validated. In some pathways, Carb may ask you to resubmit and restart that clock, but in general, they're really trying to hit that 6-month window. So more than likely, it's going to take you 3 quarters to get a pathway certified to be able to use and generate credits. In some Tier 2 pathway applications, that's been streamlined to 6 months. It will be no shorter than two quarters, because you've got to collect the 90 days in 1 quarter and then go through all the activities in the 2nd quarter. And then remember, you generate credits or you report credits at the end of each quarter. So as long as you have that process done within that 6-month time frame, you could use that pathway at the end of the 2nd quarter, or if that takes into the 3rd quarter, you'll be able to use that end of the 3rd quarter. So most likely, in most cases, not 6 to 9 months. I would plan on the latter and plan for 9 months without that. Again, you can store gas, and people are doing that, so you're not generating no revenue, or you're not losing that revenue while you're waiting for this, but you may be delaying it till the end of the quarter. Something we didn't touch on, there is a temporary pathway that you can use, especially for dairy and swine, at -150, and you can generate credits on that while you're waiting for your pathway to be certified. That may be one technique that you can use to generate revenue earlier, but note that it will be at -150, and if your CI score is better than that, you're going to lose that differential for those couple of quarters, and then you'll use your full CI score once that's certified.
Right, it's for 2 quarters. You can have it extended for a 3rd quarter, but Carb's very sticky on doing that. They prefer just to get the certification done in the 2 quarters.
Yeah, good questions. Appreciate everyone's time and attention today. Lindsay, do you have anything to close it out?
Nothing right now, but feel free to check out our website and our blog. That's where all of our old webinars are stored. You can watch all of our old webinars on demand. Feel free to check that out and follow us on social media, and we will let you know when our next webinar is coming up.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.